Mr. Moretti, if you truly love Isabella, you'll sign over the Beacon Hill penthouse. We need assets from important families, not paper wealth from construction men. Those were the words Charles Whitmore Folter, my daughter's fiancé, said to me the night before their wedding. Imagine that. 72 years of hard work, sweat, and sacrifice dismissed in a single sentence in the living room of the very home I bought with my own calloused hands. I didn't shout. I didn't slam the table. I simply looked at him and nodded slowly, the way my old construction crews used to say, "Boss has that smile, somebody's about to learn an expensive lesson." My name is Lawrence Moretti, son of immigrants from Naples. I grew up hauling bricks on the docks of Boston, barely speaking English, eating bread and olive oil for dinner because meat was too dear. But those docks, those bricks, those endless nights of aching muscles, they built more than my back. They built a foundation. Today, Moretti Properties owns over 1,200 rental units across New England, 10 commercial towers, and a portfolio worth north of $150 million. And yet in the eyes of Charles Whitmore, Yale Law graduate heir to Boston's old money legacy, I was nothing more than a construction man with paper wealth. Charles stood there in his custom-tailored tuxedo cufflinks, sparkling like he'd stepped off the cover of Forbes. Behind him, Isabella, my only daughter, my pride and joy, shifted uncomfortably, her silk rehearsal dress rustling in the quiet. She wouldn't meet my eyes. "Charles," I said evenly, "you want me to sign over a $12 million penthouse as part of a marriage contract." He smiled as if he were explaining something simple to a stubborn child. "It isn't just a penthouse, sir. It's stability. Optics. A Whitmore marriage requires assets from families who matter. Not just cash, but heritage. Tangible proof that Isabella is marrying upward. Upward." That word struck me like a hammer to the chest. For decades, I believed I had given Isabella upward. The first Moretti to graduate Harvard. 4 years of tuition at $75,000 a year paid in full. Summer programs abroad, every opportunity money could buy, earned through 40 years of calloused hands and 16-hour days. And now this boy, this polished aristocrat, stood in my living room and told me I was not enough. That the family name Moretti engraved on skyscrapers and stamped on contracts from Providence to Portland wasn't heritage. I glanced at Isabella. Her lips parted as though she wanted to speak, but Charles's hand pressed lightly against her arm, silencing her. That small gesture told me everything. This wasn't partnership. This was control. "Mr. Whitmore," I said slowly, "you've made your request. I'll consider it." His smile widened, mistaking my calm for surrender. "Good. I knew you'd see reason. Tomorrow, when we finalize the papers, we can celebrate knowing Isabella's future is secure." He walked out of my home like a man who'd already won. I remained at the mantel, staring at a photograph of my late wife, Maria. Her dark eyes seemed to watch me from behind the glass. We buried her 6 years ago, cancer stealing her, before she could see Isabella walk across Harvard Yard in her crimson gown. Maria had always told me Lorenzo men can own buildings, but God owns the ground beneath them. Stay honest, and the Lord will lift you higher than any rich family name. I whispered into the quiet. "You were right, Maria. You always were." That night, I understood something deep in my bones. Charles hadn't just insulted me. He had insulted every immigrant who ever laid a brick in this country, every man and woman who traded blood for opportunity, every parent who worked themselves to the bone so their children could rise higher. Now, before I take you further into this story, I want to pause for just a second. If you've ever been dismissed, belittled, or treated as if you didn't belong despite everything you built, leave a comment. I want to know I'm not the only one who's lived through this kind of disrespect. Because what Charles Whitmore didn't know is that I've spent a lifetime building more than concrete towers. I built relationships, loyalty, and influence in every boardroom and city office from Boston to New Haven. And tomorrow when the Whitmores tried to put me in my place, they'd learn just how dangerous it is to underestimate a man who has nothing left to prove and everything left to protect. I didn't sleep much that night. At 72, you'd think my bones would ache from climbing scaffolding, not from pacing my own hardwood floors. But I kept hearing Charles's voice over and over, assets from important families. Heritage. Upward. Heritage. I ran my hand along the mahogany banister of my Beacon Hill townhouse, polished smooth from decades of use. My fingers traced the grain of the wood, and I remembered another staircase long ago, one that creaked under the weight of 6 Moretti children in a 2-bedroom flat in East Boston. My father had built that banister himself out of scrap lumber from the shipyards. We didn't have much, but we had pride. My parents crossed the Atlantic with 2 trunks, a few coins sewn into a hem, and more faith than food. My mother would light a single candle before the picture of the Madonna every Sunday night and whisper, Dio provvederà. God will provide. And he did. Not in money, not right away, but in strength, in the kind of endurance you can't buy with inheritance. I could still hear her voice the morning I left school at 16 to haul bricks at the port. She pressed a rosary into my palm. Lorenzo, God gave you these hands. Work with them honestly, and he will bless what they touch. I kept that rosary in my pocket for decades, through blistered summers and frozen winters, through the lean years when banks turned me away because my last name wasn't Whitmore or Prescott or Cabot. Through the nights, Maria and I counted pennies to buy our first lot in Dorchester. When I met Maria, I was 25 and covered in cement dust. She laughed at me for bringing cannoli to our first date in a cardboard box tied with string. But she loved me anyway, because she saw not just a laborer, but a man with dreams. Together, we built Moretti Properties from a single duplex into a company that reshaped the Boston skyline. She was my partner, my anchor, my fiercest critic, and my greatest believer. On nights when I doubted myself, when city inspectors demanded bribes or rival developers tried to muscle me out, Maria would place her hand over mine and whisper, "The Lord lifts up the lowly." He has always lifted you, Lorenzo. When she passed 6 years ago, I thought my world ended. But Isabella was still there, our miracle child born after a decade of prayers. Every decision after Maria's death was about protecting Isabella, about honoring the life Maria and I had built for her. So when Charles looked me in the eye and called me less than heritage, he wasn't just insulting me. He was erasing Maria. He was erasing my parents, their sacrifice, their faith. I sat at the dining table and opened the old family Bible Maria had given me on our wedding day. The cover was cracked, the edges worn, but inside were years of notes, prayers scribbled in the margins, even Isabella's childhood doodles in crayon. My eyes fell on a verse I had underlined decades ago. The stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. I closed the book and laughed softly to myself. How fitting. An immigrant bricklayer's son, rejected by society's old families, had built towers that would outlast them all. And now, once again, a Whitmore wanted to reject the stone, But I knew better. My whole life had taught me better. At 3 in the morning, I poured myself a glass of Chianti from my cellar wine Charles had sneered at, as for workers, and sat by the window overlooking the Boston Common. The city was quiet lights shimmering across the park. I thought of Maria, of my parents, of every worker who had stood by me swinging hammers in the snow, laying brick until their backs gave out. I thought of Isabella asleep upstairs, caught between two worlds, and I prayed, not for revenge, not even for victory. Lord, I whispered, give me the strength to protect my daughter. Give me wisdom to see through lies and courage to stand when they try to push me down. If this marriage is built on sand, let it crumble before it buries her. And if I must be the stone they reject again, let me be strong enough to bear it. The candle flickered in the window. Peace settled over me like a blanket. By dawn, my decision was clear. I would not fight Whitmore arrogance with anger. I would fight it with the only weapons I had ever trusted: honest work, loyal relationships, and faith that the truth always rises. And when the sun rose over Boston that morning, I knew one thing for certain: tomorrow, at the grandest wedding the Whitmores had ever planned, they would learn what God's cornerstone really looked like. In the weeks leading up to the wedding, I learned there is more than one way to erase a man. Sometimes it's not done with fists or shouts. Sometimes it's done with a smile, a pen stroke, and a whispered suggestion that spreads like rot. The Whitmores were masters of this. It began small, like hairline cracks in a wall. At the engagement party, I noticed the guest list had shrunk. My name was still printed at the top, Lawrence Moretti, father of the bride. But where were the names of my friends, the old bricklayers who had worked beside me for 30 years? The parish priest who baptized Isabella. Even my sister Angela was mysteriously conflicted out of her invitation. When I asked Isabella, she hesitated, eyes darting toward Charles. Dad, the Whitmores think it might be better to keep things simple. A smaller circle, you know, smaller circle. That was their polite way of saying, your people don't belong. I said nothing, but the words sat heavy in my gut. At the tasting dinner 2 weeks later, the erasure grew bolder. I brought a bottle from my own cellar, a vintage Chianti Maria, and I had aged since Isabella's christening. I thought it would be a symbolic gesture wine that carried the story of our family opened on the night we celebrated the joining of two families. Charles swirled it in his glass, sniffed, and set it down untouched. Interesting choice, Lawrence, he said, his tone smooth as polished marble. But for the wedding, we'll serve a Brunello di Montalcino from the Whitmore Reserve. Guests expect a certain refinement. Refinement. I stared at the bottle, the same one Maria had once cradled, promising we'd save it for a milestone. And just like that, the meaning behind 3 decades of patience was dismissed as unrefined. Then came the rehearsal dinner. A coordinator from their side pulled me aside before the toasts. Mr. Moretti, there's been a small adjustment. We'd prefer if you didn't make a speech tomorrow. Nothing personal, but sometimes accents can be distracting for guests unfamiliar with them. Mr. Whitmore suggested it might be better if Isabella's uncle delivers the father's toast. My accent. 50 years in this country. Deals signed in boardrooms from Boston to Providence. Towers raised with my name etched into the cornerstone. And suddenly the vowels in my last name made me unfit to honor my daughter on her wedding day. I smiled at the coordinator, the same smile my crews used to fear. I'll think about it, I said. But the final insult came when Charles himself slid a manila folder across the mahogany table at the Whitmore estate. "Prenup," he said casually. "Just standard procedure, to protect Isabella's future." I flipped through the pages. My Beacon Hill penthouse, 3 rental towers in Cambridge, a $40 million bundle of assets listed neatly under marital security agreement. All in Isabella's name, but controlled by Charles through something called Whitmore Family Trust. "You want me to sign over $40 million, I asked, my voice even. "Think of it as a gesture," Charles replied smoothly. "A demonstration that the Moretti family is serious about joining with the Whitmores. It's not about money, it's about legacy. Families like ours must safeguard the next generation. Families like ours." That was the moment I knew. They didn't see Isabella as my daughter. They saw her as a dowry, a transaction. And me, I was simply the delivery man. That night, Isabella came to me, tears in her eyes. "Dad, please don't make this harder than it already is. Charles just wants to make sure we're secure." I took her hands in mine. They were soft, manicured, nothing like Maria's, which had always carried traces of flour from the bakery. "Bella, my love, security doesn't come from contracts. It comes from trust. Do you really believe this paper makes you safe?" She pulled away. "It's complicated, Dad. His family has expectations." I looked at her, my Harvard graduate, my miracle child, and I saw the tug of war inside her. Love pulling one way, fear pulling another. And I knew the Whitmores had already started to win. I walked home that evening beneath the cold Boston sky, my breath visible in the air. The city lights glimmered off the Charles River towers I had built, casting long shadows. All my life I had fought to carve a place for the Moretti name. Now at 72, I was being told that name was still not enough. But I also knew this erasing me would not be easy. Because every brick I laid, every loan I repaid, every life I touched, had written my name into this city more permanently than any Whitmore pedigree ever could. And soon, very soon, they would learn that when you try to erase a man like me, you only sharpen his resolve. The Whitmores didn't stop at insults, at erasing friends, or even at silencing me from speaking at my own daughter's wedding. They wanted something far greater, something that would strip me not just of dignity, but of the very foundation I had built with my life. It came on a gray Tuesday afternoon inside the Whitmore family library. Walnut shelves stacked with leather-bound volumes of law and history loomed over me like silent judges. The air smelled of cigar smoke and polished wood. Charles sat across from me, his father beside him, both men wearing the same cold smile I had seen on corporate lawyers who thought they already owned you. Mr. Moretti said, "Charles's father, Jonathan Whitmore, adjusting his gold cufflinks. We've reviewed the draft agreement Charles showed you. The trust arrangement is non-negotiable. The Beacon Hill penthouse, the Cambridge rental towers, and your commercial holdings on Tremont, all of them will secure Isabella's future within the Whitmore legacy." I leaned back, folding my hands. "That's $40 million. Jonathan's smile never wavered. "A small price, wouldn't you say, for the assurance that your daughter will forever be part of an established American family? After all, money is fleeting. Legacy is permanent." Legacy. That word again. I thought of my father, who never saw more than a few $1,000s in his lifetime, yet left me a legacy of honesty, grit, and faith. Was that not permanent enough? Charles cleared his throat. "Lawrence, it's not meant to offend. It's optics. With the Whitmore name, Isabella will have opportunities beyond imagination, political circles, business alliances, doors money alone cannot open. But those circles require assurance, tangible assurance. Otherwise, he spread his manicured hands as if the outcome was obvious. Otherwise, I prompted. Otherwise, there may not be a wedding. The words hit like a wrecking ball. I looked at my daughter. Isabella sat near the window, her hands clasped in her lap, eyes downcast. She didn't speak. She didn't defend me. She didn't even flinch. The silence told me everything. The Whitmores had managed to twist love into leverage. I stood my chair, scraping the marble floor. So let me understand. I built a company worth $150 million. I put my daughter through Harvard with no debt. I give her every opportunity a father can. And your condition for marrying her is that I hand you 40 million more as proof I'm good enough. Jonathan rose slowly, towering over me. His voice was smooth, rehearsed. It isn't about you being good enough, Mr. Moretti. It's about Isabella becoming more. Families like ours safeguard tradition. Families like yours work hard. Admirable, yes. But different, different. A polite word for lesser. I nodded once the same way I had nodded when city officials tried to squeeze bribes out of me back in the 70s. Back then, they learned what happened when they underestimated an immigrant with more faith than fear. The Whitmores were about to learn the same lesson. That evening, Isabella found me outside staring at the Boston skyline. Dad, please. Just sign it. Charles means well. His father just wants to make sure we'll be secure. Secure Isabella does a woman become secure by erasing her father's name from her life, by mortgaging her marriage with blood money, her eyes filled with tears. It's complicated. His family has expectations. I shook my head. And what about our family's expectations? Did your mother raise you to trade dignity for appearances? Did I work myself into the grave so you could marry into chains? She flinched, but didn't answer. I realized then how deep the Whitmore grip ran. She was torn, but fear of losing that gilded world kept her quiet. Before I tell you what happened next, let me pause for a moment. If you're still with me, if you've ever watched someone you love get blinded by promises of wealth or status, type 1 in the comments. I need to know I'm not the only father who's felt powerless in moments like this. As Isabella walked back inside, I whispered a promise to Maria's picture tucked in my wallet. They may think they've bought my silence, but they have no idea who they're dealing with. The Whitmores thought they had cornered me with their contracts, their heritage, their so-called refinement. But what they didn't know was that my faith had carried me through darker nights, my hands had built more than towers, and my loyalty reached deeper into this city than their pedigrees ever could. They thought this was about money. It was about to become about truth. And truth I knew was on my side. When you've spent 5 decades in construction, you learn that cracks never stay hidden for long. You can plaster paint and polish, but eventually the foundation tells the truth. And the Whitmores. Their foundation was already crumbling. The night they shoved that $40 million trust agreement in my face, I went home and pulled out an old leather notebook. Not blueprints this time, but names, men and women I'd built with broken bread, with fought city hall with. Contacts I had cultivated the way other men cultivate vineyards. My first call was to an old friend, Detective Michael Riley, now retired. but still with ears in the Boston PD. I didn't say much, just asked if the Whitmore law firm had ever crossed his radar. His pause told me more than his words. Larry, I can't speak on the record, but if I were you, I'd dig deeper, and fast. So I did. At 72, I may walk slower, but I've never been more deliberate. I called in favors like chips at a card table. My banker owed me for saving his son's failed condo project. A state inspector remembered how I refused to bribe him in '84 and still delivered a tower ahead of schedule. My network stretched across Boston like steel beams. By the end of the week, I had files. And what I saw chilled me more than any insult. The Whitmore law firm, that shining beacon of old money respectability, had been laundering cash through offshore trusts in the Cayman Islands. Hundreds of millions moved through shell companies with names as hollow as their promises: North Atlantic Holdings, Mariner Trust, Blue Harbor Management. On the surface, all polished. Underneath, rot. And Charles wasn't some innocent groom. He was knee-deep in the scheme. Documents showed his signature on wire transfers, $6 million in the last 18 months alone, funneled through elderly clients' estates. They were using probate accounts, pensions, even college funds to cover their tracks. I felt my jaw tighten. These weren't just numbers on a ledger. These were lives. Retirees who'd saved pennies. Families counting on tuition money. The Whitmores had stolen futures while lecturing me about heritage. I needed more than suspicions. So I called in the sharpest man I knew, Anthony DeMarco, a private investigator who used to serve with me in the Army Reserves. He owed me for landing him his first big corporate case back in the '90s. Within 48 hours, Tony had slipped me a flash drive the size of my thumb. Careful with this, Larry, he warned. It's dynamite. Client complaints, SEC filings, even whispers about federal probes. They're circling. The feds are just waiting for the right push. That night in my study, I scrolled through hundreds of pages. Complaints from widows whose funds had vanished. Bank records showing offshore transfers. An internal memo from the SEC flagging irregularities. And right there, Charles's name stamped again and again. The man who told me I wasn't important enough to sit at his wedding tables was running out of tables to sit at himself. But the revelation wasn't just about Charles. It was about Isabella. Because buried in those files was correspondence between Charles and his father discussing leveraging Moretti assets to stabilize cash flow. They weren't marrying my daughter for love. They were marrying her to siphon the company I had bled for to patch the holes in their sinking ship. I sat back, closing my eyes, hearing Maria's voice as clear as the day she left me. Lawrence, love that demands you erase your family isn't love. It's slavery. I clenched my fist around her rosary. The next morning, I attended Mass at St. Anthony's, the same church my parents had knelt in when we first arrived from Naples. I sat in the last pew, sunlight streaming through stained glass, and whispered a prayer. Lord, you've shown me their foundation. Now give me the strength to bring it into the light. Not for vengeance, but to protect Isabella. If truth is my hammer, let me swing it steady. For the first time in weeks, peace settled on my shoulders. Faith has a way of cutting through noise, reminding you that you don't need to shout to be heard. Sometimes you just need to stand. When I left the church, I didn't head home. I went straight to the U.S. Attorney's office. A contact there, a young prosecutor I'd once mentored through college by giving him summer work on my sites, met me in a quiet corner. I handed him Tony's flash drive, Everything you need, I said. But understand, I'm not here for revenge. I'm here to save my daughter. He looked at me gravely. Mr. Moretti, this could bring down one of Boston's oldest families. I met his eyes without flinching. Then maybe it's about time. Because the only thing they've built is a house of cards. That evening, as the city lights flickered on, I stood by my office window, Beacon Hill glowing across the river. The Whitmores thought they had cornered me with contracts and pedigree. But I had something stronger, truth, faith, and 50 years of loyalty etched into every brick of this city. The erasure was over. The reckoning had begun. The Saturday before the wedding, I found myself awake long before dawn. At 72, you get used to waking early, but this was different. Sleep wouldn't come no matter how tightly I shut my eyes. My chest carried a weight I hadn't felt since the day Maria passed. The Whitmores thought they had me boxed in with contracts, pedigrees, and threats of exclusion. They thought a construction man couldn't touch them in their ivory towers. But the flash drive Tony had given me sat on my desk humming like a live wire, evidence of their rot waiting for daylight. Still, I hesitated. Not out of fear for myself. What could they take from me I hadn't already given to this country? No, I hesitated because of Isabella. She loved him, or thought she did. And the truth I was about to unleash would shatter her heart. So I went where I always went when I needed clarity. At 5 a.m, the streets of Boston were empty as I walked to St. Anthony's. The old stone church stood quiet against the breaking sky, its doors unlocked for early prayers. I slipped inside, and the smell of incense and old wood wrapped around me like an embrace. I lit a candle at the side altar, the same spot where Maria used to kneel. Its flame flickered weak against the vast darkness, but steady. Always steady. Dropping to my knees, I pressed her rosary between my palms. Lord, I whispered, I've swung hammers my whole life. I've built towers of steel and glass. But today I need a different kind of strength. Not for me. For my daughter. The words poured out heavy but honest. I know the truth now. I know Charles and his family are thieves hiding behind old names. I know they plan to steal not just from the poor, but from Isabella herself. You've shown me their foundation is hollow. Now I ask for courage to tear it down before it buries her. For a long moment, I just listened to the silence. And then I felt it, not a voice, but a peace, the same kind of peace I'd felt on scaffolds 40 stories high, when the wind howled, and my grip was all that stood between life and death. Faith doesn't always give answers, but it gives resolve. And that morning I walked out of St. Anthony's knowing exactly what I had to do. The plan began with a phone call. At 7 sharp, I called Tony. Get everything duplicated. If one copy goes missing, I want 5 more in the hands of people who can't be bought. Understood, he said. And Larry, once this goes public, there's no putting it back. I know. Do it anyway. Next, I rang my attorney, a man I'd built half his offices for 20 years ago. We talked strategy, subpoenas, timing. He agreed the evidence was ironclad. The feds are circling already. If you nudge them, they'll move sooner rather than later. That was the point. The Whitmores wanted a wedding. I wanted a reckoning. And if the reckoning happened on their wedding day, well, justice sometimes has a sense of humor. By afternoon, I was making calls across the city. Hoteliers, club owners, caterers, every man and woman whose business I had helped save over 3 decades. I didn't need to strong-arm anyone. Loyalty doesn't require force. It requires trust earned over years. Mr. Moretti, one hotel manager said quietly. If you're asking me to cancel, I'll cancel. You don't even need to explain, another whispered. We remember what you did for us after the flood in '09. If the Whitmores are dirty, we don't want their stain on our floors. By evening, 5 venues were off the Whitmore list. By midnight, 3 more. 11 in total would fall before the week was done. That night, as I looked over the city lights from my office window, Isabella's face haunted me. She had asked me once as a girl why I worked so hard, why I left before sunrise and came home after dark. I told her, so you never have to feel small in this world. Now here she was, about to marry into a family that had spent months making both of us feel smaller than dust. I touched the rosary once more. Maria, I whispered, our girl is blind right now, but she'll see. And when she does, I pray she forgives me for tearing down the dream she thought she wanted. Better a dream lost than a life destroyed. Faith gave me peace, but resolve gave me fire. By the time the wedding day arrived, the Whitmores would discover that while they boasted of heritage and prestige, I carried something far more powerful, the truth sharpened by prayer and wielded like a hammer. And once that hammer struck, there would be no rebuilding their empire of lies. By Wednesday morning, 3 days before the wedding, the cracks in the Whitmore empire began to show. And it started with a single phone call. Mr. Moretti came the voice of Mrs. Kavanaugh, manager of the Fairmont Copley Plaza. I regret to inform you that due to unforeseen circumstances, we'll no longer be able to host the Whitmore wedding this Saturday. The deposit will, of course, be refunded. Unforeseen circumstances. That was polite language for, we don't want their name tied to ours anymore. I thanked her and hung up. The hammer had fallen on the first venue, and it wouldn't be the last. By noon, I had spoken to 5 more people. The Ritz-Carlton, the Boston Harbor Hotel, the Four Seasons, all luxury towers, where I had once overseen multi-million-dollar renovations, suddenly discovered scheduling conflicts. The Cathedral of the Holy Cross, where the Whitmores had planned a grand Catholic ceremony, suddenly required structural assessments before large gatherings. Even the Harvard Club, their precious old money playground, quietly rescinded its booking after my lawyer shared a folder of damning evidence. I didn't need to shout. I didn't need to threaten. All it took was one sentence spoken calmly into the receiver. If you continue with this event, you may be linked to federal investigations against the Whitmore family. Silence. A sharp intake of breath. And then the inevitable, we understand, Mr. Moretti. By Thursday afternoon, the panic had reached Charles. He stormed into my office on Tremont Street, face red, collar askew. What the hell are you doing? He demanded. I leaned back in my chair, hands folded, as calm as ever. I don't know what you mean. Don't play coy with me, old man. 11 venues. 11. Do you expect me to believe that's coincidence? I smiled the way my crews always feared. Coincidence, no. Consequence. His jaw tightened. You're destroying Isabella's happiness. Do you understand that she loves me? I tapped the folder on my desk, thick with documents. She loves the man she thinks you are, not the thief who laundered $6 million through shell trusts. For the first time, he faltered. His eyes darted to the folder like it was a loaded gun. You can't prove anything, he muttered. Maybe not in this office, I said, but the SEC and the FBI think otherwise. And they don't care about cufflinks or pedigrees. They care about wire transfers and stolen pensions. That night, Isabella called me in tears. Dad, everything's falling apart. Charles says you're interfering. Venues keep canceling, caterers are pulling out. What's happening? My voice was steady. Bella, sometimes God answers our prayers by breaking apart what isn't meant to stand. She sobbed softly. I just wanted this wedding to be perfect. I closed my eyes, picturing Maria's face. Perfection doesn't come from chandeliers and champagne, sweetheart. It comes from truth. And the truth is finally rising. Friday morning, the media storm broke. The Boston Globe ran a headline, Whitmore Law Firm under federal investigation, alleged money laundering through family trusts. Underneath, photographs of Charles and his father walking into their office, faces grim, no longer the polished princes of Boston society. My investigators' flash drive had done its work. The story spread like wildfire, financial channels, social media whispers in boardrooms. By evening, the Whitmore name was radioactive. Judges declined invitations. Politicians quietly withdrew RSVPs. Even their so-called allies pretended they'd never heard of them. And Isabella, she called again, voice shaking. Dad. Charles says you leaked this. I said nothing. Did you? She pressed. Bella, I said finally, I only opened the window. The rot was already there. The world just needed to smell it. That night I walked the halls of my home, stopping before the mantel where Maria's picture still stood. I whispered, It's begun, love. Their tower is falling. And when it does, Isabella will be free. The city outside hummed with Friday night life bars, restaurants, laughter. But in the Whitmore estate across town, there was no laughter. There was only panic. And I knew by the time the wedding day arrived, there would be no wedding at all. Only ruin. Saturday morning dawned bright and cold, the kind of Boston morning that makes the Charles River shine like steel. It should have been a day of celebration. But at the Whitmore estate, beneath the rented white tents and manicured gardens, there was a tension in the air thick enough to choke on. Guests arrived in black limousines, and Bentley's pearls flashing cufflinks, glinting chatter muted. They came expecting a grand union of old money and new ambition. What they found instead was the slow unraveling of a dynasty. I arrived late on purpose, wearing a simple black suit. Not a tuxedo from the Whitmore tailor, just my own. I walked past murmuring guests, past waiters whispering about canceled venues and missing caterers, until I reached the back patio where Isabella stood. She was radiant in her gown, but her eyes, my God, her eyes were clouded with fear. That she whispered, clutching my hand, Please, whatever you're planning, don't humiliate me today. I looked at her and saw Maria's face in hers, the same strength buried under years of doubt. Bella, I said softly, truth may hurt, but lies kill. Better you hurt today than spend a lifetime chained to a fraud. She swallowed, trembling, but didn't argue. Somewhere deep inside, she already knew. By noon, nearly 200 guests had filled the estate lawn. Federal judges, state senators, banking magnates, faces the Whitmores had bragged about for months. A string quartet played softly. The groom appeared, Charles Whitmore, smug in his tailored tuxedo. His father walked beside him, stiff-backed, trying to project authority, even as whispers rippled through the crowd about federal probes and missing millions. The ceremony began. The priest cleared his throat, but before he could speak, a black SUV rolled up the driveway. Then another, and another. The crowd turned. Doors opened. Out stepped men and women in dark suits, sunglasses gleaming in the afternoon light. 3 letters printed bold on their jackets, FBI. A gasp rippled across the garden. Margaret Whitmore, Charles's mother, went pale. Jonathan stiffened, his jaw clenched. Charles's confident smile cracked like cheap plaster. I stepped forward. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, my voice carrying across the stunned crowd. "Before we proceed, there is something you deserve to know." I pulled a folder from my coat. Pages rustled like thunder. For months, this family has hidden behind a name pretending heritage equals honor. But honor isn't inherited. It's earned. Murmurs swept the guests. Cameras clicked. These documents, I continued holding them, high-show wire transfers signed by Charles Whitmore himself, millions laundered through offshore trusts, stolen from widows, retirees, even college funds meant for children. "No," Charles shouted, face crimson. "This is slander." I pressed a button on the small speaker Isabella had set up for music. His own voice filled the garden. "Mr. Moretti, families like yours work hard. Admirable, yes. But families like ours safeguard tradition. Families like yours, different." The recording cut to another line. "Lawrence, if you love Isabella, you'll sign over the penthouse. 40 million in assets, otherwise there may not be a wedding." Gasps, whispers, outrage. Every face turned toward Charles. The same judges and senators he had boasted about were now stone-faced, some slipping out their phones, others already edging toward the exit. Margaret Whitmore shot to her feet. "How dare you bring this circus into our family celebration?" I looked her dead in the eye. "Your family did this, not me. You raised a son who preys on the weak, who steals from the old, who demands a dowry of $40 million like we're living in the dark ages. Don't blame me for turning on the lights." 2 FBI agents stepped forward. "Charles Whitmore, you're under arrest for wire fraud, money laundering, and securities violations." The crowd erupted. Gasps, shouts, phones raised to capture every moment. Charles tried to back away, stammering, "This is a mistake. I'm a Whitmore." "You can't do this here," but the cuffs clicked anyway. Heritage means nothing to steel bracelets. And then, the moment I'll never forget. Isabella stepped forward, veil trembling eyes clear at last. She faced the crowd. "This was supposed to be my wedding day. Instead, it's the day I learned what real love isn't. A man who asks you to erase your family doesn't love you, he uses you. A family that demands a price tag doesn't honor you, they sell you. My father may not have old money, but he has something far greater: integrity. And today, I stand with him." Applause broke out, not from the Whitmores' side, but from mine. My construction crew in the back, dressed awkwardly in borrowed suits, clapped until their hands were red. Others joined them. Guests murmured approval. Even some politicians nodded, calculating their alliances anew. Charles was led away in handcuffs, shouting promises of revenge that no one believed. His parents followed, faces masks of disgrace. The quartet had long since stopped playing. The wedding was over, but as I put my arm around Isabella, I realized something. Maybe the wedding had been canceled, but a union had been restored. Not with the Whitmores, but between a father and his daughter, stronger than any contract. And as the FBI cars pulled away, I whispered to Maria's picture in my wallet, "Our girl is free." The following Monday, the headlines blazed across every paper in Boston. Whitmore heir arrested in federal sting. $600 million laundering scheme exposed. There was Charles's photo, handcuffed head, bowed his Yale ring, catching the flash of cameras. For decades, the Whitmores had polished their name until it gleamed like marble. Now, in the space of one weekend, it was rubble. But while the Whitmores scrambled to hire lawyers and spin excuses, my thoughts were not on them. My thoughts were on Isabella. She sat across from me at the kitchen table in her wedding dress. Not the dress itself, she had hung it in the closet upstairs, never to be worn, but the silk shawl she had draped over her shoulders, a relic of a day that never happened. Her eyes were swollen from crying, yet steady now, like storm clouds finally clearing. "Dad," she said quietly, "I owe you an apology." "You owe me nothing, Bella." "Yes, I do." Her voice trembled, but she didn't look away. "For months I let them make me ashamed of you, of our family. I let their words get in my head, that you weren't refined enough, that we weren't enough. And when you tried to warn me, I stayed silent." I reached across the table and took her hand. It was cold, but she squeezed back. "Bella, love blinds even the strongest of us. I don't blame you. What matters is you see clearly now." Her lips curved into a small, weary smile. "You always told me truth hurts, but lies kill." I didn't understand until now. In the days that followed, she stayed with me in the Beacon Hill townhouse. We walked the common in the mornings, sat on the porch in the evenings, and little by little she began to heal. One night she brought me a folder. "Dad, I've been thinking. The people Charles stole from the widows, the families, the retirees, they'll never get their peace back. But maybe we can help them get their lives back." Inside the folder were notes she had written, proposals for a victim assistance fund, community projects, scholarships. My eyes stung as I read them. "Maria would be proud," I whispered. Isabella blinked. "You think so, I know so. She prayed you'd grow into a woman of compassion. And here you are turning betrayal into blessing." Within a month, the Moretti Foundation for Families was born. We seeded it with $10 million from my own holdings, money I had planned for a retirement villa in Tuscany. Instead, it went to rebuild pensions fund, medical expenses, and restart dreams that the Whitmores had stolen. At our first meeting, I watched Isabella address a room of victims, her voice steady, her eyes bright. "My family knows what it is to be dismissed, to be told you don't belong," she said. "But today we stand together. Today we say no more." Applause broke out raw and real. And for the first time since Maria's death, I felt a surge of pride so powerful it brought tears. The Whitmores, meanwhile, were finished. Charles pled guilty. His father faced disbarment. Their Beacon Hill mansion went up for sale, stripped of paintings and chandeliers. Old money, it turned out, could run out faster than they ever imagined. But I didn't celebrate their downfall, not out loud. Because my greatest victory wasn't their ruin. It was Isabella's freedom. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the skyline, Isabella and I stood on the roof deck of one of our properties, looking out over the city we both called home. Towers we had built rose in every direction, their windows catching fire in the sunset. "You know what I realized, Dad?" she said softly. "What's that? Heritage isn't about old names. It's about what you leave behind. You and Mom built a life from nothing. That's our heritage. And I want to carry it forward." I placed an arm around her shoulder, pulling her close. "That's all I ever wanted, Bella. Not for you to marry into marble halls, but to walk proud in your own." She leaned her head against me, her voice a whisper. "I think I finally understand." As night fell, I opened my wallet and touched Maria's picture. "She's safe now," I whispered to the face that had walked with me through every trial. "She's free." The city lights glittered, and for the first time in months, peace filled my chest. The Whitmores had thought they were teaching us our place. But in the end, it was my daughter who stood tall, and it was our family name, Moretti, that would live on with honor. And maybe that was the true redemption, not revenge, not headlines, not even justice in court, but the quiet certainty that faith and truth had carried us through the storm. 3 months later, Boston had already moved on to new scandals. Politicians resigning, corporations, collapsing headlines, spinning like weather vanes. But one story still lingered in the whispers of Beacon Hill dinner parties, the fall of the Whitmores. For me, though, the story was never about them. It was about Isabella and the lesson we both carried from the wreckage. One Sunday morning, we walked together into St. Anthony's, the same church where my parents had once knelt as poor immigrants, with calloused hands. The pews creaked under our weight. Sunlight spilled through stained glass, and for the first time in years, I felt Maria with us again. During the service, Isabella gripped my hand. When the priest spoke of forgiveness, she leaned close and whispered, "Do you think I'll ever forgive myself for being blind?" I squeezed her hand gently. Bella, faith isn't about never stumbling. It's about getting back up when you do. God already forgave you the moment you opened your eyes. The question is, can you forgive yourself? Tears welled in her eyes, but this time they weren't from shame. They were from release. After Mass, we walked across the common. Isabella looked up at the skyline where towers we had built gleamed in the morning sun. "You know, Dad, the Whitmores thought heritage was a mansion or a family crest. But I think it's this." She pointed toward the workers unloading steel beams at a new site. "It's leaving something real behind, something that stands." I smiled. Exactly. Buildings fall, money vanishes. But what you build in people, the loyalty, the faith, the respect that lasts, that's heritage. The Moretti Foundation had already begun restoring stolen pensions. Families who thought they'd lost everything were receiving checks, help with mortgages, even scholarships for their children. Isabella had thrown herself into the work, her Harvard degree finally serving something more than prestige. At one meeting, a widow named Mrs. Alvarez clutched Isabella's hands and said, "Because of you, I can stay in my home. Because of your family, my husband's work wasn't wasted." I saw my daughter's eyes light up in a way no diamond ring or high society banquet had ever managed. That was the light Maria used to carry the light of knowing you've given dignity back to someone who lost it. As for the Whitmores, their empire crumbled in courtrooms and tabloids. Charles received a 12-year federal sentence, though with good behavior he might serve 9. His father's law license was stripped. Their mansion was sold at auction to pay restitution. I never saw them again. I didn't need to. Because the truth is, the best revenge isn't watching an enemy fall. It's standing tall yourself. It's knowing you've built a life no scandal can touch. One evening, Isabella and I sat together on the rooftop of the Beacon Hill penthouse they once demanded I sign over. The city spread out beneath us, glittering and alive. She sipped a glass of my Chianti, the same wine Charles had called for workers. "You know," she said softly, "I used to think marrying into the Whitmores would make me someone. But I finally understand I already was someone. Because I was your daughter." My throat tightened. I looked up at the stars and whispered a quiet prayer. Thank you, Lord, for bringing her back. And so I leave you with this. Faith is not a shield that spares us from pain. It is a compass that points us through it. Without my faith, I might have given up. Without my faith, Isabella might have married a fraud and lived in chains. But because we held on, the truth surfaced, justice came, and dignity was restored. If you've been dismissed, betrayed, or told you don't matter, remember this: the stone the builders reject can still become the cornerstone. I lived it. My daughter lived it. And you can too. If you believe that faith, truth, and dignity are stronger than lies and betrayal, hit subscribe and share this story. Somewhere out there, another father, another daughter needs to hear it. As the bells of St. Anthony's tolled in the distance, I looked at Isabella and smiled. The Whitmores had wanted to erase my name. Instead, they gave me back my daughter. And that, I realized, was the greatest heritage of all.